The retired librarian moved through his morning routine with the precision of a man who had found comfort in predictability. Coffee at 6:15, toast with marmalade at 6:30, and by 6:45 he was stepping out into the crisp October air of Northville, Maine, his carved wooden walking stick tapping against the sidewalk in a steady rhythm dot at 76. Walter had the constitution of a man 20 years younger. His mind remained sharp, his step sure, and his daily walk through St. Elias Cemetery had become as much a part of the town's morning routine as the church bells that chimed at 8 o'clock. Neighbors could set their clocks by his passage. The gentle man with the silver hair, who always nodded politely and never failed to stop if someone needed help. But on this particular morning, something felt different in the air. The leaves rustled with an unusual urgency, and the shadows seemed to cling longer to the ground than they should have. Walter paused at his front door, his hand hovering over the brass handle, as if some instinct was warning him to stay inside. "Don't be foolish, Walter," he muttered to himself, the sound of his own voice cutting through the strange tension. "Martha would have called you a superstitious old fool." The mention of his late wife's name brought the familiar ache to his chest, but also the determination to continue. These walks weren't just exercise. They were his way of talking to Martha, of sharing the morning with the woman who had been his companion for 43 years. She was buried in St. Elias Cemetery, and every morning he would pause at her grave, update her on the neighborhood gossip, and tell her about the book he was reading now. As Walter made his way down Maple Street, the familiar sights and sounds of his neighborhood began to soothe his earlier unease. Mrs. Chun was already tending to her prized rose garden, her small form bent over the flower beds, with the dedication of someone who understood that beauty required daily attention. She looked up as Walter passed, her weathered face breaking into a smile. "Morning, Walter," she called out, her voice carrying the slight accent that spoke of a life lived in multiple worlds. "Beautiful day for a walk." "Indeed it is, Mrs. Chun. Your roses are looking particularly lovely this year." She beamed at the compliment, her eyes crinkling with pleasure. "I've been talking to them more. My grandmother always said plants grow better when you tell them your troubles." Walter chuckled, tapping his walking stick against the sidewalk. "Perhaps I should try that with Martha's garden, though I suspect she might have something to say about my pruning technique." The exchange was warm, comfortable, part of the social fabric that made small-town life feel like an extended family. But as Walter continued his walk, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. It was nothing concrete, just a prickle at the back of his neck, the sense of eyes following his movement. He turned to look behind him, but saw only the empty street, the morning shadows playing tricks with his perception. A dog barked in the distance, and a car engine turned over somewhere in the neighborhood, but nothing seemed out of place. The path to St. Elias Cemetery wound through a small grove of maple trees, their leaves a brilliant tapestry of red and gold. Walter had always loved this time of year, when the world seemed to be preparing for sleep by putting on its most beautiful clothes. Martha had felt the same way, and they had spent countless autumn afternoons walking these very paths, their hands linked, their conversation flowing as naturally as the stream that ran behind the church dot as he approached the cemetery gates. Walter noticed that the usual groundskeeper wasn't visible. Reed Mallory typically arrived early, his pickup truck parked near the maintenance shed, but today the cemetery felt unusually quiet. Walter had never been entirely comfortable with Reed. There was something about the man's intensity that made him uneasy. Reed had a way of appearing suddenly, as if he had been waiting just out of sight, and his conversations always seemed to carry an undercurrent of something Walter couldn't quite identify. The cemetery gate stood open, its iron hinges creaking softly in the morning breeze. Walter paused at the entrance, his hand resting on the cool metal of the gate post. The headstones stretched out before him in orderly rows, each one a testament to a life lived, a story concluded. He had walked among them so many times that he knew many of the inscriptions by heart, had created mental biographies for the people whose names were etched in stone. Martha's grave was located in the newer section, about halfway through the cemetery. The headstone was simple granite, her name and dates carved in elegant script, with the words "beloved wife and mother" beneath. Walter had chosen those words carefully, knowing that they captured the essence of who Martha had been, a woman who had made everyone around her feel loved and valued. As he approached her grave, Walter felt the familiar tightness in his throat. Even after all these years, the sight of her name carved in stone still felt surreal, as if he might wake up and find her in the kitchen, humming while she made breakfast. "Good morning, sweetheart," he said softly, his voice carrying in the still air. "I brought you the weather report. Mrs. Chun thinks we might get rain later this week, so I should probably get the gutters cleaned before the first snow." He stood quietly for a moment, his hand resting on the walking stick, his eyes focused on the small bouquet of flowers he had left the previous week. The petals were beginning to fade, but they still held their color, still carried the sweet fragrance that Martha had always loved. "I've been thinking about that trip to Ireland we never took," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "Remember how we used to plan it every winter? We'd spread those travel brochures across the kitchen table and argue about whether to see the Cliffs of Moher or the Ring of Kerry first." The memory brought a smile to his face, and for a moment he could almost hear Martha's laughter, could almost feel her hand slip into his. But the moment passed, and he was alone again among the headstones, the morning air growing cooler as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Walter was about to continue his walk when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see a figure approaching. Through the cemetery paths, a tall man in work clothes, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who knew the ground well. It was Reed Mallory, the groundskeeper, carrying a rake and wearing an expression that Walter found difficult to read. "Morning, Mr. Grady," Reed said, his voice carrying an odd note of familiarity that made Walter slightly uncomfortable. "You're out early today." "Same time as always," Walter replied, his grip tightening slightly on his walking stick. "I like to keep to a schedule." Reed nodded, his eyes scanning the cemetery grounds with the practiced gaze of someone who noticed every detail. "Schedules are important," he said. "They help people know where to find you." There was something in the way Reed said those words that made Walter feel uneasy. The groundskeeper had always been friendly enough, but there was an intensity about him that seemed to go beyond professional interest. Walter had noticed that Reed often appeared when he was visiting Martha's grave, as if he had been waiting for the right moment to strike up a conversation. "I should be getting back," Walter said, taking a step toward the cemetery's main path. "My neighbor will worry if I'm late." "Of course," Reed replied, but he didn't move aside. Instead, he seemed to study Walter's face with an expression that was almost calculating. "You know, I've been working here for 3 years now, and I've gotten to know all the regular visitors. You're the most faithful one here every single morning, rain or shine." Walter felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Martha was my wife. It's important to me to visit her." "I understand," Reed said, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. "Loss is a difficult thing to bear. Sometimes people do things they never thought they would do, just to feel close to someone they've lost." The conversation was making Walter increasingly uncomfortable. There was something about Reed's manner, the way he stood too close, the way his eyes seemed to be searching for something in Walter's face, that set off every instinct the older man had developed over 7 decades of life. "I really should be going," Walter said firmly, stepping around Reed and heading toward the main path. "Good day to you." But as he walked away, Walter could feel Reed's eyes on his back, could sense the man watching his every step. The comfortable rhythm of his morning walk had been disrupted, and he found himself moving more quickly than usual, eager to reach the safety of the cemetery gates. The path wound through the older section of the cemetery, where the headstones were weathered and tilted, their inscriptions worn smooth by decades of Maine weather. Walter had always found this section peaceful, a reminder of the continuity of life and death, but today it felt different. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more profound, and every rustling leaf sounded like footsteps following behind him. As he approached the cemetery gates, Walter noticed that his walking stick was making a different sound against the path, a hollow tapping that seemed to echo off the headstones. He paused, listening, and realized that there was indeed an echo, but it wasn't coming from his stick. Someone else was walking the same path, matching his rhythm, staying just out of sight behind him. Walter's heart began to beat faster. He told himself that it was probably just another early morning visitor, someone else who preferred the quiet hours for their remembrance. But the matching footsteps felt too deliberate, too synchronized to be coincidental. He reached the cemetery gates and turned to look back, but the path behind him was empty. The footsteps had stopped, and the cemetery was silent except for the once distant sound of a bird calling from the maple trees. Walter stood there for a long moment, his hand resting on the iron gate, trying to convince himself that his imagination was playing tricks on him. The walk back to his house took him past St. Elias Church, a stone building that had anchored the community for over a century. The church had been Walter's second home for many years. He had served on the board of trustees, helped organize the annual Harvest Festival, and spent countless hours in the basement archives, cataloging historical documents and photographs. As he passed the church entrance, Walter noticed that the heavy wooden donation boxes mounted on either side of the door looked different somehow. One of them, the one nearest the confessional booth, seemed to have fresh scratches around the lock, as if someone had been trying to open it. The brass slot where people dropped their contributions was also more worn than he remembered. The metal polished smooth by frequent use. Walter paused to examine the box more closely. The church had installed these donation boxes years ago, sturdy wooden containers with brass fittings that were designed to be virtually impossible to break into. They were only open twice a year, during the spring and fall financial reviews, and the keys were kept in the church office safe. But something about this particular box bothered Walter. The wood around the lock showed signs of recent disturbance, and there were fresh scratches in the brass that caught the morning light. He reached out to touch the box, and as his fingers made contact with the wood, he felt a strange sensation, chill that seemed to travel up his arm and settle in his chest. "Is something wrong, Walter?" The voice came from behind him, and Walter spun around to find Red Mallory standing just a few feet away. The groundskeeper had approached so quietly that Walter hadn't heard him coming, and the sudden appearance made his heart skip a beat. "Reed," Walter said, his voice slightly breathless. "I didn't hear you approach." "I was just finishing up some work in the cemetery," Reed replied, his eyes fixed on Walter's face. "I saw you examining the donation box. Is there a problem?" Walter looked back at the box, then at Reed, trying to read the expression in the younger man's eyes. "It looks like someone might have been tampering with it. The lock seems damaged." Reed stepped closer, his movements fluid and controlled. "I haven't noticed anything unusual," he said, his voice carrying a note of concern that sounded almost theatrical. "But then again, I don't pay much attention to the church business. That's not my responsibility." There was something in Reed's tone that made Walter step back slightly. The groundskeeper was standing too close, his body positioned in a way that made Walter feel trapped between the man and the church wall. The morning air suddenly felt thick and oppressive, and Walter realized that his hands were trembling slightly. I should mention it to Pastor Williams, Walter said, trying to keep his voice steady. He'll want to know if there's been any attempted break-in. Of course, Reed agreed, but his eyes had hardened, and Walter could see something calculating in his expression. Though I wonder what someone would want with a donation box. There's never much money in those things. Walter didn't respond. He was too focused on the growing sense of unease that was settling over him like a heavy blanket. Every instinct was telling him to get away from Reed, to put distance between himself and the man who was watching him with such uncomfortable intensity. I really should be getting home, Walter said, taking another step back. My neighbor will be worried if I'm late. Which neighbor would that be? Reed asked, his voice taking on a conversational tone that somehow made the question more unsettling. Mrs. Chun? She seems like a nice lady, very observant. The fact that Reed knew about Mrs. Chun, knew about Walter's routine in such detail, sent a chill down the older man's spine. How do you know about my neighbor? Reed smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Small-town Walter. People talk. People notice things. Like how you visit the cemetery every morning at the same time. How you always stop at the same grave. How you always take the same path home. Walter felt a surge of fear that was stronger than anything he had experienced since Martha's death. Reed wasn't just making conversation. He was demonstrating knowledge that felt invasive, threatening. The groundskeeper had been watching him, studying his movements, learning his habits. I need to go, Walter said, his voice firm despite the fear that was coursing through him. Good day, Reed. But as he turned to leave, Reed's hand shot out and gripped his arm. The contact was firm, almost painful, and Walter could feel the strength in the younger man's fingers. Wait, Reed said, his voice dropping to a whisper. I think we should talk, Walter. Really talk. About loss, about grief, about the things people do when they can't let go of the past. Walter tried to pull his arm free, but Reed's grip tightened. Let go of me, he said, his voice rising slightly. I don't want to talk to you. But I want to talk to you, Reed replied, his eyes boring into Walter's face. I've been wanting to talk to you for a long time. About Martha, about your walks, about the way you visit her grave every single morning like she's still alive. The mention of Martha's name from Reed's lips felt like a violation, and Walter's fear transformed into anger. Don't you dare mention. My wife, he said, his voice shaking with emotion. You don't know anything about her, about us. I know more than you think, Reed said, his grip on Walter's arm becoming painful. I know that you can't let go. I know that you're living in the past, that you're wasting your life talking to a dead woman who can't hear you anymore. Walter tried again to pull free, but Reed was too strong. The younger man's fingers were digging into his arm, and Walter could feel bruises forming under his sleeve. Let go of me, he said again, his voice carrying a note of desperation that he hated hearing. I'm trying to help you, Walter, Reed said, his voice taking on a tone of mock concern. I'm trying to show you that there's a better way to deal with loss, a way that doesn't involve clinging to the past like a drowning man. I don't want your help, Walter replied, his free hand tightening on his walking stick. I want you to leave me alone. Reed's expression changed, becoming harder, more predatory. I can't do that, Walter. You see, I've been watching you for months now, and I've come to understand something about you. You're not just grieving, you're obsessed. And obsession can be dangerous. Walter felt a chill of pure terror. Reed wasn't just being inappropriate, he was threatening him, and they were alone behind the church, with no one else in sight. The morning that had started with such peaceful routine had transformed into a nightmare, and Walter realized that he might be in serious danger. Please, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Just let me go home. Reed studied his face for a long moment, and Walter could see something shifting in the younger man's eyes, a decision being made, a line being crossed. I'm afraid I can't do that, Walter. You see, I've been planning this conversation for a long time, and I need you to understand something important. What? Walter asked, his voice trembling with fear. Reed leaned closer, his breath hot against Walter's ear. I need you to understand that some walks have to end. What happened next would remain a mystery for 12 years. Walter's walking stick was found leaning against the cemetery gate, positioned so carefully that it seemed almost ceremonial. His silver watch, with its precious engraving, disappeared along with the gentle man who had worn it faithfully for over a decade. But the story didn't end with Walter's disappearance. It continued in the hearts of the people who loved him, in the questions that haunted his daughter Margot, and in the secrets that lay hidden behind the stone walls of St. Elias Church. The search for Walter Grady began within hours of his disappearance. Led by Police Chief David Morrison, a man who had known Walter since childhood. Morrison had grown up in North Bell, had watched Walter transform from a young librarian into a pillar of the community, and the idea that someone so stable and predictable could simply vanish was almost incomprehensible. We'll find him, Morrison told Walter's daughter Margot when she arrived from Boston that afternoon. Your father is a creature of habit. He couldn't have gone far. But as the hours turned into days, and the days into weeks, Morrison's confidence began to waver. The search teams had covered every inch of the cemetery, the surrounding woods, and the neighborhoods beyond. They had drained the old quarry on the outskirts of town, searched abandoned buildings, and followed up on every possible lead. Margot Grady Sullivan was a successful attorney who had inherited her father's methodical nature and her mother's fierce determination. She took leave from her law firm in Boston and moved temporarily back to North Bell, coordinating volunteer search efforts and pressuring the police to expand their investigation. My father didn't just wander off, she told Morrison. During one of their increasingly tense meetings, he was sharp as a tack, and he never deviated from his routine. Something happened to him. Morrison had to admit that Margot was right. Walter hadn't shown any signs of dementia or confusion. His house was in perfect order, his bills paid, his calendar filled with the routine appointments of a man who was planning for the future. There was no indication that he had chosen to disappear, no evidence of depression or despair. We're treating this as a potential crime, Morrison assured her. We're looking at everyone who had contact with your father, checking backgrounds, following up on any suspicious activity. But the investigation was frustrating in its lack of concrete leads. Walter had been universally liked in the community. He had no enemies, no debts, no complicated relationships that might have led to violence. He was simply a quiet widower who had found comfort in routine and solace. In his daily visits to his wife's grave, the only person who seemed to raise any red flags was Reed Mallory, the part-time groundskeeper at St. Elias Cemetery. Several neighbors mentioned that they had seen Reed following Walter during his morning walks, and Mrs. Chun reported that she had witnessed what looked like a heated conversation between the two men just days before Walter's disappearance. There was something about that man that bothered me, Mrs. Chun told Morrison during her interview. He was always watching Mr. Grady, always appearing when he was visiting his wife's grave. It wasn't normal behavior. Morrison brought Reed in for questioning, but the interview was frustrating. Reed claimed to have been fond of Walter, said he had enjoyed their conversations about grief and loss. He had an alibi for the morning of Walter's disappearance. He claimed to have been working in a different section of the cemetery, but there were no witnesses to confirm his story. I'm concerned about Mr. Grady, Reed told Morrison, his voice filled with what sounded like genuine worry. He seemed to be struggling more lately, talking to his wife's grave like she was still alive. I was trying to help him, trying to show him that there were healthier ways to deal with loss. Morrison studied Reed's face, looking for any sign of deception, but the man seemed genuinely concerned. His story was consistent, his manner appropriately distressed, and there was no physical evidence linking him to Walter's disappearance. "We'll need you to stay available," Morrison told him. "This investigation is ongoing, and we may have more questions." Reed nodded solemnly. "Of course. I want to help in any way I can. Mr. Grady was a good man, and I hope you find him safe." But privately, Morrison was beginning to have doubts about Reed's story. There was something about the man's manner that didn't quite ring true, a performance quality to his concern that made the police chief uneasy. Morrison had been in law enforcement for 25 years, and he had developed an instinct for when someone was hiding something. The problem was that instinct wasn't evidence, and without concrete proof, Morrison couldn't arrest Reed or even designate him as a person of interest. The investigation stalled, and as the weeks passed, the search teams were gradually reduced. The media attention faded, and the case of Walter Grady's disappearance began to fade into the background of daily life in Northville. But Margot refused to let her father's case go cold. She hired a private investigator, a former state police detective named Frank Delacroix, who specialized in missing persons cases. Delacroix was a methodical man who understood that the key to solving cold cases was often found in the details that others had overlooked. "Tell me about your father's routine," Delacroix said during their first meeting. "Everything. What time he got up, what he ate for breakfast, which route he took, who he talked to. The smallest detail might be important." Margot walked Delacroix through Walter's daily routine, from his morning coffee to his evening reading. She showed him the path Walter took through the cemetery, pointed out Martha's grave, and described the various people her father encountered during his walks. "He was a creature of habit," she explained. "He found comfort in predictability, especially after Mom died. The morning walk was sacred to him. It was his time to talk to her, to feel connected to her memory." Delacroix listened carefully, taking notes and asking detailed questions. He was particularly interested in Reed Mallory, the groundskeeper, who had been questioned but never charged. "What was your impression of him?" Delacroix asked. "I only met him once," Margot replied, "at the church harvest festival about a year before Dad disappeared. He seemed ... intense. He talked about loss and grief like he was an expert on the subject, but there was something artificial about it, like he was reciting lines he had memorized." Delacroix nodded. "Did your father ever mention him?" "Once or twice. He said Reed made him uncomfortable, that the man seemed to know too much about his routine. Dad was a private person, and he didn't like feeling watched." "But he never felt threatened enough to change his routine?" Margot shook her head. "That wasn't Dad's way. He was from a generation that believed in facing problems head-on, not running from them. Besides, he couldn't imagine that anyone would want to hurt him." Delacroix spent the next several weeks retracing Walter's steps, interviewing neighbors, and reviewing the police files. He was particularly interested in the timeline of events on the morning of Walter's disappearance, and he began to notice discrepancies in Reed's story. According to Reed, he had been working in the east section of the cemetery that morning, repairing a damaged headstone. But when Delacroix checked the cemetery records, he found no work order for that date, no record of any repairs being made. Reed had claimed to be working alone, with no witnesses to confirm his alibi. More troubling was what Delacroix discovered about Reed's employment history. The man had worked at several cemeteries and funeral homes throughout New England, and in each case, he had been quietly let go after complaints from families about his inappropriate behavior with grieving relatives. "He has a pattern," Delacroix told Margot during one of their meetings. "He targets people who are vulnerable, who are dealing with loss. He inserts himself into their grieving process, claims to be helping them, but really he's feeding off their pain. Do you think he hurt my father? Delacroix was quiet for a long moment. I think your father represented something Reed couldn't control. Walter was devoted to your mother's memory, but he wasn't broken by it. He had found a way to honor her memory while still living his life. That kind of healthy grieving would have been threatening to someone like Reed. But what happened to him? Where is he? I don't know, Delacroix admitted, but I'm going to find out. The investigation took a new turn when Delacroix decided to focus on the church itself. St. Elias had been central to Walter's life, and it was also where Reed had been employed. Delacroix began interviewing current and former church employees, looking for any information about Reed's behavior or access to the building. What he discovered was disturbing. Reed had been given keys to the church building as part of his groundskeeping duties, and several employees reported that he had been found in areas where he had no business being: the basement archives, the pastor's office, even the confessional booth. We had to change the locks, explained Helen Martinez, the church secretary. Reed claimed he was just checking for damage after a storm, but there had been no storm. Pastor Williams was concerned about his behavior, but Reed quit before. We could terminate him. When did he quit? Delacroix asked. 2 weeks after Walter disappeared. He said he was moving out of state for a better job, but he left without giving proper notice. We never received a forwarding address. Delacroix felt a chill. Reed had disappeared just 2 weeks after Walter vanished, and he had left no trace of where he was going. The private investigator immediately contacted Police Chief Morrison, who began the process of trying to track Reed's movements after he left Northbell. What they found was a trail that led nowhere. Reed had indeed left Maine, but his subsequent movements were difficult to trace. He had worked briefly at a cemetery in New Hampshire, then disappeared again. There were reports of someone matching his description, working at various funeral homes and cemeteries throughout New England, but always under different names, always leaving before anyone could establish a pattern. He's a ghost, Morrison told Delacroix. Either he's very good at covering his tracks, or he's had help, or he's dead, Delacroix replied grimly. People who commit crimes sometimes eliminate witnesses, including themselves. The investigation continued for months, but without Reed to question and without Walter's body, there was little concrete evidence to pursue. The case remained officially open, but practically speaking, it had gone cold. Margot eventually returned to Boston, but she never stopped hoping for answers. She established a reward fund for information about her father's disappearance, and she made sure that his case was featured on missing persons websites and in cold case databases. Every Father's Day, she would return to Northville and walk her father's route, placing flowers at the cemetery gate where his walking stick had been found. I know he's gone, she told Delacroix during one of their final meetings. I've accepted that I'll probably never see him again, but I need to know what happened to him. I need to understand why someone would want to hurt a man who never hurt anyone. Delacroix understood her need for closure, but he also knew that some cases were never solved, that some questions were never answered. He continued to work Walter's case whenever he had time, following up on leads and checking for any sign of Reed Mallory. But as the years passed, the trail grew colder and hope grew dimmer. The people of Northville gradually moved on with their lives, but Walter's disappearance had left a scar on the community. The cemetery felt different, less safe, and many of the older residents began to vary their routines, unwilling to walk alone in the early morning hours. The sense of security that had defined small-town life had been shattered, and in its place was a lingering fear that evil could strike anyone, anywhere, at any time. Mrs. Chun continued to tend her roses, but she no longer worked in her garden. Alone, she had installed motion sensor lights around her property and kept her doors locked even during the day. The friendly openness that had characterized her relationship with Walter had been replaced by a cautious wariness that extended to all strangers. "I keep thinking I see him," she told her daughter during one of their weekly phone calls. "I'll be working in the garden, and I'll see a man walking down the street, and for just a moment, I think it's Walter. But then I remember that he's gone, and I feel sad all over again." Pastor Williams of St. Elias Church struggled with his own guilt about Walter's disappearance. He had known that Reed's behavior was inappropriate, had been planning to address it, but had waited too long to act. If he had terminated Reed earlier, if he had taken the complaints more seriously, Walter might still be alive. "I failed him," Williams told his wife one evening as they sat in their living room, the weight of regret heavy in his voice. "I saw the signs. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't want to believe that evil could exist in our church." The church itself seemed to carry the weight of Walter's disappearance. The congregation was smaller now, and there was a tension in the air during services that hadn't been there before. The donation boxes that had once been simple fixtures became objects of unease, reminders of the mystery that had never been solved. But life in North Bell continued, as it always did. Children grew up, seasons changed, and new families moved to town. The story of Walter Grady's disappearance became part of the local folklore, a cautionary tale told in hushed tones, but it gradually faded into the background of daily life. Until 12 years later, when renovations to St. Elias Church uncovered a secret that would bring all the pain and questions rushing back. The renovation of St. Elias Church in 2024 was long overdue. The building had been constructed in 1887, and while it had been well maintained, the heating system needed updating, the electrical wiring required replacement, and the basement archives needed better climate control to preserve the historical documents stored there. The project was overseen by Tom Bradley, a contractor who had grown up in North Bell and had known Walter Grady personally. Bradley had been one of the volunteers who had searched for Walter 12 years earlier, and he had never forgotten the gentle man who had helped him with his school research projects when he was a teenager. "Mr. Grady was the one who taught me to love history," Bradley told his crew as they began work on the church. "He spent hours with me in the basement archives, showing me old photographs and documents about the town's founding. He was a good man, and he deserved better than what happened to him." The renovation was proceeding smoothly until the crew reached the donation boxes mounted on either side of the church entrance. These heavy wooden containers had been installed in the 1950s and were built to be virtually indestructible. Were bolted to the stone pillars and secured with heavy brass locks that required special keys to open. When Bradley's crew began to remove the boxes, they discovered that one of them was significantly heavier than the other. The box nearest the confessional booth seemed to be weighted down by more than just coins and envelopes, and when they shook it, they could hear something metallic rattling inside. "This one sounds different," said Maria Santos, one of Bradley's workers. "Like there's something solid in there, not just paper and change." Bradley examined the box carefully. The wood around the lock showed signs of old damage, scratches and gouges that suggested someone had tried to open it forcibly. The brass slot where donations were inserted was worn smooth, polished by frequent use. "When was the last time these boxes were opened?" Bradley asked Pastor Williams. "We open them twice a year," Williams replied. "Spring and fall, during our financial reviews. But this particular box hasn't been opened since ... double quotes." He paused, calculating. "Since fall of 2012. We discovered that the lock was damaged, and we couldn't get it open. We ordered a replacement, but somehow it never got installed." Bradley felt a chill. Fall of 2012 was exactly when Walter Grady had disappeared. He looked at the damaged box with new eyes, wondering what secrets it might contain. "I think we should open it," he said quietly. Whatever's inside, it's been there for over a decade. Pastor Williams nodded, though he looked troubled. I'll get the backup key from the safe. But when Williams returned with the key, they discovered that the lock had been damaged beyond repair. The key wouldn't turn, and the mechanism had been jammed with what looked like glue or some other substance. We'll have to cut it open, Bradley said. But first, I think we should call the police. Police Chief Morrison had retired years earlier, and his replacement, Chief Sarah Chun, Mrs. Chun's daughter, who had returned to Northbell after completing her law enforcement training, arrived within minutes of Bradley's call. Tell me exactly what you found, Chun said, her voice calm and professional, despite the fact that Walter's disappearance had been one of the defining mysteries of her childhood. Bradley explained about the weight of the box, the rattling sound, and the evidence of tampering around the lock. Chun examined the box carefully, noting the same details that Bradley had observed. This box hasn't been opened in 12 years? She asked Pastor Williams. Not since before Walter disappeared, Williams confirmed. We meant to have it repaired, but somehow it never got done. The other box was sufficient for collections, so we just forgot about it. Chun nodded grimly. I'm going to call the state police. If there's any chance this is connected to Walter's disappearance, I want to make sure we handle it properly. The state police arrived with a crime scene team and a specialized locksmith. Detective Lisa Park, who had recently been assigned to the cold case unit, took charge of the investigation. Park had reviewed Walter's file as part of Herit Tria Contorti to bring fresh eyes to unsolved cases, and she was immediately intrigued by the discovery. This could be nothing, Park told the assembled crowd of church officials, contractors, and curious neighbors who had gathered. But given the timing and location, we need to treat this as potential evidence. The locksmith worked carefully, using specialized tools to avoid damaging whatever might be inside the box. The lock had been thoroughly sabotaged, filled with hardened epoxy that had made it impossible to open with the original key. Someone had deliberately sealed this box, intending for it never to be opened. When the lock finally gave way, Detective Park carefully lifted the wooden lid. Inside, among a collection of old envelopes and tarnished coins, she found something that made her breath catch in her throat. A silver wristwatch, slightly tarnished with age, lay nestled among the donations. Even before she could examine it closely, Park could see the distinctive engraving on the back, the words that had been featured in every missing person flyer and news article about Walter Grady's disappearance. Every hour, I remember you. But it wasn't just the watch that made Park's heart race. Folded beneath it was a piece of paper, yellowed with age, with writing that was barely legible after 12 years in the humid donation box. Park carefully extracted the note with tweezers, unfolding it to reveal a message written in block letters. He never stopped walking. The crowd that had gathered around the church entrance fell silent. Tom Bradley felt tears welling in his eyes as he recognized the watch that Walter had worn every day for over a decade. Pastor Williams crossed himself and whispered a prayer. Mrs. Chun, who had been drawn to the commotion, placed a trembling hand over her mouth. We need to clear the area, Park announced, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. This is now a crime scene. But even as the crowd dispersed, word of the discovery spread through Northbell like wildfire. Within hours, everyone in town knew that Walter Grady's watch had been found, and that there was a message that suggested his disappearance had been anything but accidental. Margot Grady Sullivan received the call at her law office in Boston. Detective Park's voice was professional, but gentle as she explained what had been found. I need you to come to Maine to identify the watch, Park said. I know this is difficult, but we need to be absolutely certain that it belongs to your father. Margot's hands were shaking as she hung up the phone. After 12 years of uncertainty, of wondering and hoping and grieving. She finally had something concrete, a piece of evidence that might lead to answers about what had happened to her father. Drove to North Bell that evening, her mind racing with possibilities. The watch in the donation box proved that someone had deliberately hidden evidence of her father's disappearance. But who? And why? And what did the cryptic message mean? He never stopped walking. The words echoed in her mind as she drove through the familiar streets of her childhood. What did they mean? Were they a confession? A taunt? A clue to where her father's body might be found? Detective Park met her at the police station, and together they examined the watch that had been carefully photographed and catalogued as evidence. Margot recognized it immediately, not just the engraving, but the tiny scratch near the clasp that she had accidentally made when she was 8 years old and had dropped the watch while playing with it. "That's my father's watch," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He wore it every day after my mother died. He said it helped him feel connected to her memory." Park nodded, making notes. "Can you think of anyone who might have wanted to hurt your father? Anyone who had access to the church?" "The groundskeeper," Margot said immediately. "Reed Mallory. My father mentioned that the man made him uncomfortable, that he seemed to know too much about his routine." "We're already looking into Reed's background," Park assured her. "But he disappeared shortly after your father vanished. We're having difficulty tracking him down." Margot studied the note that had been found with the watch. The block letters were obviously disguised handwriting, but there was something familiar about the phrasing. "He never stopped walking" wasn't just a random statement. It felt personal, like something someone who had known her father would say. "My father believed that his morning walks were a way of staying connected to my mother," she explained to Park. "He would talk to her grave, tell her about his day, share his thoughts and feelings. To him, those walks were sacred." Park made more notes. So this message could be referring to that ritual? Someone who knew about his visits to the cemetery? "It's possible," Margot agreed. "But it could also be more literal. Maybe whoever wrote this is saying that my father is still walking somewhere, that he's still alive." The possibility that her father might still be alive after 12 years was almost too much to contemplate. Margot had spent years coming to terms with his death, accepting that she would never see him again. The idea that he might be imprisoned somewhere, or that he might have been forced to assume a different identity, opened up possibilities that were both hopeful and terrifying. Detective Park launched a comprehensive investigation into the discovery. The donation box was examined for fingerprints, but 12 years of handling by church volunteers had contaminated most of the evidence. The note was sent to a handwriting analysis expert, and the watch was tested for DNA evidence. More importantly, Park began to reconstruct the timeline of events from the morning of Walter's disappearance. She interviewed everyone who had been questioned 12 years earlier, looking for inconsistencies in their stories, and she began to build a detailed profile of Reed Mallory. What she discovered was disturbing. Reed had a history of obsessive behavior toward grieving individuals, and he had been fired from several jobs for inappropriate conduct. But more troubling was what Park found when she dug deeper into his personal history. Reed Mallory had been born in 1975 in a small town in Vermont. His parents had died in a car accident when he was 12, and he had been raised by an aunt who described him as troubled and obsessed with death. He had dropped out of high school, worked a series of menial jobs, and had never held steady employment for more than a few years. But the most significant discovery came when Park found records of Reed's psychiatric treatment. He had been hospitalized twice for what doctors described as complicated grief disorder and obsessive-compulsive tendencies related to death and mourning. The records suggested that Reed had developed an unhealthy fixation on other people's grief, particularly elderly individuals who had lost spouses. He sees himself as some kind of guide or teacher, explained Dr. Richard Hendricks, the psychiatrist who had treated Reed during his second hospitalization. He believes that he can help people achieve a more authentic relationship with death and loss. But his methods are intrusive and harmful. Park asked the obvious question: could he be capable of violence? Dr. Hendricks was quiet for a long moment. Reed has never shown direct violent tendencies, he said finally, but he has a grandiose sense of his own importance, and he becomes agitated when people don't respond to his help the way he expects. If someone resisted his attempts to guide them through their grief, he might escalate his behavior. The psychiatric records also revealed something else troubling. Reed had been prescribed antipsychotic medication, but had stopped taking it shortly before he began working at St. Elias Cemetery. His aunt had expressed concern about his mental state, but Reed had cut off contact with his family and moved to Maine. He was getting worse, Dr. Hendricks explained. His obsession with death and grief was becoming more pronounced, and his ability to distinguish between helping and harming was deteriorating. Park shared this information with Margot, who felt a chill of recognition. That explains why my father felt so uncomfortable around him. Dad was always good at reading people, at sensing when something wasn't right. The question is what happened that morning, Park said. Did Reed confront your father? Did they have an argument? And if so, what happened to your father's body? The investigation took on new urgency as Park realized that Reed might still be alive, might still be targeting other grieving individuals. She issued a nationwide alert with Reed's description and began contacting law enforcement agencies in areas where he might have worked. The response was immediate and disturbing. Over the next week, Park received reports from police departments in 6 different states describing incidents involving a man matching Reed's description. In each case, the man had been employed at a cemetery or funeral home, had been reported for inappropriate behavior toward grieving families, and had disappeared before he could be questioned. He's been doing this for years, Park told Margot during one of their regular phone calls. Your father wasn't his first victim, and he probably wasn't his last. The revelation that Reed had been targeting grieving individuals across New England was both horrifying and enlightening. It suggested that Walter's disappearance hadn't been random, that he had been specifically chosen because of his ritual visits to Martha's grave. But it also raised a crucial question. If Reed had been killing people for years, where were the bodies? A serial killer who had been operating for over a decade would have left a trail of victims. Yet there was no evidence of multiple disappearances that matched Reed's pattern. Park began to develop a theory that was both disturbing and strangely hopeful. What if Reed wasn't killing his victims? What if he was taking them somewhere, holding them captive, trying to force them to accept his twisted version of help? The idea that Walter might still be alive after 12 years was almost too much for Margot to contemplate. She had grieved for her father, had accepted his death, had even begun to find peace with the mystery of his disappearance. But now, faced with the possibility that he might be imprisoned somewhere, she felt a renewed urgency to find him. If he's alive, she told Park, we have to find him. We have to bring him home. Park agreed, but she also knew that the chances of finding Walter alive after 12 years were extremely small. If Reed had been holding him captive, the conditions would have been brutal, and the psychological trauma would have been severe. Still, the discovery of the watch and the note suggested that Reed wanted his crimes to be discovered, that he was leaving clues for someone to follow. The investigation expanded to include a search for any property that Reed might have owned or rented during his time in Maine. Property records showed that he had never owned land in his own name. But Park discovered that he had been renting a small cabin in the woods about 20 miles from Northville. The cabin was owned by an elderly man named Eugene Hartwell, who lived in Florida and rarely visited his main property. Hartwell confirmed that he had rented the cabin to Reed during the summer of 2012, but he had lost contact with his tenant shortly after Walter's disappearance. He paid cash for 6 months in advance, Hartwell told Park during a phone interview. Said he was a nature lover, wanted to get away from civilization. He seemed quiet and polite, so I didn't ask too many questions. Park obtained a search warrant for the cabin, and she assembled a team that included state police investigators, crime scene technicians, and a cadaver dog. The cabin was located in a remote area, accessible only by a dirt road that wound through dense forest. When they arrived at the property, Park was struck by how isolated it was. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pine trees that blocked most of the sunlight. It would have been the perfect place to hold someone captive, far from any neighbors who might hear screams or notice suspicious activity. The cabin itself was small and poorly maintained, with a single room that served as both living area and bedroom. But what caught Park's attention was the evidence of recent occupancy. The furniture was arranged in a way that suggested someone had been living there, and there were signs of cooking and daily activities. More disturbing was what they found in the basement. The small underground room had been fitted with a heavy wooden door and a sophisticated lock system. The walls were lined with soundproofing material, and there were chains and restraints bolted to the floor. Someone was held here, Park said, her voice grim. Recently. The cadaver dog immediately alerted to several areas of the basement floor, suggesting that decomposition had occurred there. But when the crime scene team began excavating, they found something unexpected. Instead of human remains, they found a collection of personal items, jewelry, watches, photographs, and other mementos that appeared to have belonged to different people. Each item was carefully preserved in a plastic bag, labeled with a date and location. Park examined the collection with growing horror. There were at least 24 bags, each containing items that had obviously been taken from victims. The dates ranged from 2008 to 2024, suggesting that Reed had been collecting trophies from his victims for over 15 years. Walter's watch wasn't among the collection, which meant that Reed had deliberately chosen to hide it in the church donation box. But why? What was special about Walter's case that made Reed treat it differently? The answer came when Park found a notebook hidden in the cabin's walls. The notebook contained detailed observations about Reed's victims, written in the same block letters that had been used for the note found with Walter's watch. The entries about Walter were different from the others. While Reed wrote about his other victims with clinical detachment, his notes about Walter were filled with anger and frustration. Subject refuses to accept help, read one entry. Continues to visit grave daily despite counseling. Obsession with deceased wife interferes with natural grieving process. Another entry was even more disturbing. Subject shows signs of healthy adaptation to loss. This is unacceptable. Must increase intervention. Park realized that Reed had been targeting Walter not because he was vulnerable, but because he was strong. Walter's ability to honor his wife's memory while continuing to live his life had threatened Reed's worldview, his belief that grief should be devastating and consuming. The final entry about Walter was chilling. Subject will be taught. Proper grief response. Will remain in custody until lesson is learned. Park felt a surge of hope. If Reed's notes were accurate, Walter might still be alive, held captive somewhere while Reed tried to break his spirit and force him to accept his twisted version of grief counseling. But the cabin had been abandoned for months, and there was no sign of where Reed might have gone. The investigation had reached another dead end, and Park was beginning to fear that they would never find Walter or Reed. Then, 3 days after the cabin search, Park received a phone call that changed everything. Detective Park? This is Officer Michelle Torres from the Camden Police Department. I think we might have your suspect. Camden was a coastal town about 50 miles from North Bell, and Torres explained that they had been investigating a series of complaints about a man who had been harassing visitors to the local cemetery. He approaches people who are visiting graves, tries to engage them in conversations about grief and loss, Torres explained. Several families have complained that he's been following them, showing up at their homes, claiming that he can help them deal with their loss more effectively. Park felt her pulse quicken. What does he look like? Mid-40s, tall, thin, dark hair. He's been using the name Robert Manning, but he doesn't have any identification to support that name. We arrested him yesterday for trespassing and harassment, and he's been asking to speak to someone about his students. I'm on my way, Park said, already reaching for her car keys. The drive to Camden felt like the longest 2 hours of Park's life. After 12 years of investigation, she might finally be face to face with the man who had destroyed Walter Grady's life and terrorized his family. But more importantly, Reed might have information about where Walter was being held. The Camden police station was a small, modern building that served the coastal community of about 5,000 people. Officer Torres met Park at the entrance and led her to the interview room where Reed was being held. He's been asking for a lawyer, Torres warned, but he also keeps saying that he has important information about his students and that he needs to speak to someone in authority. Park nodded, her mind racing with questions. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, imagining what she would say to Reed when she finally found him. But now, faced with the reality of the confrontation, she felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. The man sitting in the interview room was older and thinner than the photographs from 12 years earlier, but Park recognized him immediately. Reed Mallory had the pale, gaunt appearance of someone who had been living on the margins of society, and his eyes held the intense, unfocused gaze of someone who wasn't entirely connected to reality. Mr. Mallory, Park said, sitting down across from him, I'm Detective Park with the Maine State Police. I understand you've been asking to speak to someone about your students. Reed's eyes focused on her with sudden intensity. You're here about my work, he said, his voice carrying an odd note of satisfaction. I've been waiting for someone to understand what I've been trying to accomplish. Tell me about your work, Park said, her voice carefully neutral. Reed leaned forward, his eyes brightening with what looked like genuine enthusiasm. I help people, he said. I help them understand what real grief is, what real loss means. Too many people think they can just go on with their lives after someone dies, but that's not how it works. Death is supposed to change you, supposed to break you down and rebuild you. Park felt a chill at Reed's words. And how do you help them? I show them, Reed replied. I take them away from their comfortable lives, away from their rituals and their routines, and I teach them what it really means to lose someone. I show them that grief isn't something you visit for an hour each morning. It's something that should consume you, should become your whole life. What about Walter Grady? Park asked quietly. Reed's expression changed, becoming darker and more agitated. Walter, he said, almost spitting the name. Walter was my greatest failure. I worked with him for months, tried to show him the error of his ways, but he refused to learn. He insisted on clinging to his healthy grief, his comfortable routine, his little morning conversations with a dead woman. Where is he? Park asked, leaning forward. Reed smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Walter learned his lesson, he said. Eventually, but it took much longer than I expected. He was stubborn, resistant to proper grief education. Is he alive? Reed's smile widened. Walter is exactly where he belongs, he said. He's with his beloved Martha, having the eternal conversation he always wanted. Park felt her heart sink. Reed's words suggested that Walter was dead, that after 12 years of captivity, He had finally succumbed to his captor's abuse. But she had to be certain. "I need to know where he is," she said firmly. "His daughter deserves to know what happened to her father." Reed's expression became thoughtful. "His daughter," he mused. "Yes, I remember her. She came to visit after. He disappeared, asked all sorts of questions. She was grieving properly, the way people should grieve. She might not need my help." "Tell me where Walter is," Park repeated. Reed was quiet for a long moment. His eyes focused on something beyond the walls of the interview room. "There's a place," he said finally. "A quiet place where my students can reflect on their lessons without distraction. Walter spent his final years there, learning to understand true loss." "Where?" "The old quarry," Reed said. "The one they drained when they were looking for him. But they didn't look deep enough. They didn't understand that some lessons require permanent separation from the world." Park felt a chill of understanding. The quarry had been drained during the initial search for Walter, but it had been refilled with natural spring water over the years. If Reed had hidden Walter's body there, it would have been underwater and undiscoverable for over a decade. "What about the others?" Park asked. "The other students you mentioned?" Reed's eyes lit up again. "So many students," he said proudly. "So many people who needed to learn proper grief. Some learned quickly, some took years, but they all eventually understood." "How many?" 23, Reed said without hesitation. 23 students over the years. Each one taught me something new about the grief process, about the resistance people have to accepting their loss." Park felt sick. 23 victims over 15 years, all of them elderly people who had been targeted during their most vulnerable moments. The scope of Reed's crimes was staggering, and the fact that he spoke about his victims as students made it even more disturbing. "Where are they?" she asked. Reed shrugged. "Various places. Some are in the quarry with Walter, some are in the woods, some are in places that will never be found. The important thing is that they're at peace now, that they finally understand what real grief means." Park ended the interview and immediately called for a search team to return to the quarry. She also contacted police departments in the 6 states where Reed had been reported, coordinating a massive investigation into what was clearly one of the most extensive serial killing cases in New England history. The search of the quarry began. The next morning, divers equipped with sonar equipment and underwater cameras began the grim task of exploring the depths that had been missed during the original search 12 years earlier. What they found was heartbreaking. At the bottom of the quarry, weighted down with chains and concrete blocks, were the remains of multiple victims. The cold water had preserved the bodies, and investigators were able to identify several of the victims from Reed's trophy collection. Walter. Grady's body was found on the 3rd day of the search. He had been weighted down like the others, but his remains were positioned differently, almost ceremonially. Around his neck was a chain with a small metal plate that bore an engraving. Student. Number A, lesson completed. Park called Margot with the news, her voice heavy with sorrow. "We found your father," she said simply. "I'm so sorry." Margot cried for a long time, but there was also a sense of relief in her tears. After 12 years of uncertainty, she finally knew what had happened to her father. He hadn't wandered off in confusion, hadn't chosen to abandon his life. He had been murdered by a man who saw his healthy grief as a threat to his twisted worldview. "At least now I know," Margot said through her tears. "At least now I can bring him home." The investigation into Reed's crimes continued for months. The notebook found in his cabin led police to additional burial sites, and eventually, all 23 victims were recovered. Each one was an elderly person who had been targeted while grieving the loss of a spouse or family member. Reed was charged with 23 counts of first-degree murder, and the case became one of the most closely watched. TRILS in Maine history. During the proceedings, psychiatrists testified about Reed's mental illness, his obsession with death and grief, and his grandiose belief that he was helping his victims by teaching them proper grief responses. But the most powerful testimony came from the families of Reed's victims. One by one, they took the stand to describe their loved ones, not as students in Reed's twisted curriculum, but as human beings who had been living full lives despite their losses. Margot's testimony was particularly moving. She spoke about her father's strength, his ability to honor her mother's memory while continuing to live and contribute to his community. She described the morning walks that Reed had seen as unhealthy obsession, but which she knew had been her father's way of maintaining his connection to the woman he had loved for over 4 decades. "My father wasn't broken by grief," she told the court. "He was sustained by love. He understood that honoring the dead doesn't mean joining them. It means living in a way that makes their memory proud." Reed was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During his sentencing, he showed no remorse for his crimes, instead expressing frustration that his students had not been more receptive to his teachings. "They could have learned so much," he said, his voice carrying the same delusional intensity that had characterized his crimes. "They could have understood what real loss means, what real grief requires. Instead, they wasted their lessons." The judge who sentenced Reed called his crimes an affront to the natural process of human grieving, and noted that Reed had perverted the very compassion that should define our response to loss. After the trial, Margot was finally able to lay her father to rest beside her mother in St. Elias Cemetery. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people from North Bell and the surrounding communities, all of whom had been touched by Walter's quiet kindness and gentle nature. Pastor Williams officiated the service, and his eulogy focused on Walter's resilience and his ability to find meaning in loss. "Walter Grady understood something that his killer never could," Williams said. "He understood that love is stronger than death, that memory is more powerful than absence, and that the best way to honor those we've lost is to continue living lives of purpose and compassion." The silver watch that had been found in the donation box was buried with Walter, still engraved with the words that had sustained him through his grief. "Every hour, I remember you." It was a message that had been intended for Martha, but which had come to represent Walter's own enduring presence in the hearts of those who had loved him. Mrs. Chun, now in her 80s, spoke at the funeral about the morning conversations she had shared with Walter during his daily walks. "He was a man who understood that routine could be sacred," she said. "He showed us that it's possible to carry grief without being destroyed by it, to remember the dead without forgetting how to live." The cemetery where Walter had been murdered while visiting his wife's grave became a place of pilgrimage for people dealing with their own losses. Visitors would leave flowers at both Martha's and Walter's graves, and many reported that they found comfort in the knowledge that love could endure even the worst kinds of evil. The donation box, where Walter's watch had been hidden, was preserved as part of the church's memorial to the victims of Reed's crimes. A plaque beside it read, "In memory of those who were taken while grieving, and in honor of those who continue to love despite loss." The mystery of how Walter's watch had ended up in the donation box was finally solved during Reed's confession. He had placed it there during the weeks following Walter's disappearance, when he was still working at the church and had access to the building. The message, "He never stopped walking," had been Reed's way of claiming credit for his crime, while also expressing his frustration that Walter had continued to resist his teachings even until the end. "I wanted someone to find it eventually," Reed explained during one of his post-conviction interviews. "I wanted people to understand that Walter had been my most challenging student, that he had required the most intensive education. The watch was proof that even the most stubborn grief could be properly redirected. But to those who had known and loved Walter, the message had a different meaning entirely. He never stopped walking became a testament to Walter's enduring spirit. His refusal to be broken by Reed's abuse and his continued presence in the lives of those who remembered him. Margot established a foundation in her father's name, dedicated to supporting elderly people who were dealing with grief and loss. The Walter Grady Foundation provided counseling services, support groups, and educational programs designed to help people understand that healthy grieving was possible. That loss didn't have to be devastating and consuming. My father's death was a tragedy, Margot said during the Foundation's launch event. But his life was a testament to the power of love to transcend death. He showed us that we can honor those we've lost without being destroyed by their absence. The Foundation's first project was the creation of a memorial garden at St. Elias Cemetery, where people could come to reflect on their losses and find comfort in the knowledge that they were not alone in their grief. The garden featured a walking path that wound through carefully tended flower beds, with benches placed at regular intervals where visitors could sit and remember their loved ones. At the center of the garden was a fountain, its gentle sound providing a peaceful backdrop for contemplation. A fountain was engraved with words that captured the essence of Walter's approach to grief. Love is the bridge between memory and hope. The people of North Bell slowly began to heal from the trauma of Reed's crimes. The sense of security that had been shattered by Walter's disappearance was gradually restored, and the community came together to support the families of all the victims. Mrs. Chun continued to tend her roses, but now she also helped maintain the memorial garden, finding comfort in the knowledge that her conversations with Walter had been part of something larger and more meaningful than either of them had realized at the time. Tom Bradley, the contractor who had discovered Walter's watch, became a volunteer with the Foundation, using his skills to help elderly residents with home repairs and maintenance. He often spoke about how Walter's kindness had inspired him to become a better person, and how finding the watch had given him a sense of purpose that he had never experienced before. The church itself was transformed by the tragedy and its aftermath. The congregation grew larger and more diverse as people from throughout the region came to worship at the place where Walter's story had finally been resolved. The basement archives where Walter had once worked were expanded and improved, becoming a regional repository for historical documents and photographs. But perhaps the most significant change was in the way the community approached grief and loss. Walter's story had taught them that healthy mourning was possible, that it was acceptable to continue living and loving even after experiencing devastating loss. The annual memorial service, held on the anniversary of Walter's disappearance, became a celebration of life rather than a mourning of death. People would gather to share stories about their own losses, to offer support to those who were struggling with grief, and to remember that love was indeed stronger than death. As the years passed, Walter's story became part of the folklore of North Bell, but it was remembered not as a tale of horror and tragedy, but as a testament to the power of love to endure even in the face of evil. Children growing up in the town learned about the gentle librarian who had taught them that grief could be a form of love, that memory could be a source of strength, and that the best way to honor the dead was to live fully and compassionately. Silver watch that had been Walter's constant companion for over a decade was buried with him, but its message lived on in the hearts of those who had been touched by his story. Every hour, I remember you, became more than just an inscription. It became a promise that love would endure, that memory would sustain, and that even in the darkest moments, there was hope for healing and renewal. And in the quiet moments of early morning, when the mist still clung to the ground and the world was just beginning to wake, visitors to St. Elias Cemetery would sometimes report seeing a figure walking among the headstones. A gentle man with silver hair, carrying a walking stick. making his eternal rounds to visit the woman he had loved for over 4 decades. Whether it was imagination or something more, the sight brought comfort to those who witnessed it, a reminder that love truly was the bridge between memory and hope, and that some walks, once begun in love, never truly end. The story of Walter Grady became a beacon of hope for anyone who had experienced loss, a reminder that grief could be transformed into something beautiful and meaningful, and that even in the face of unimaginable evil, the human capacity for love and resilience could prevail. In the end, Reed Mallory had been wrong about everything. He had believed that grief should be devastating and consuming, that healthy mourning was a denial of loss. But Walter's story proved the opposite, that the deepest love could coexist with the most profound loss, that memory could be a source of strength rather than weakness, and that the best way to honor the dead was to continue living with purpose and compassion. The watch might have been hidden in a donation box for 12 years, but its message had never been lost. Every hour, Walter was remembered not as a victim of a twisted killer, but as a man who had shown an entire community how to love beyond death, how to grieve without being destroyed, and how to find meaning in the midst of loss. And in the memorial garden at St. Eli's Cemetery, where the fountain played its gentle song and the flowers bloomed in cycles of death and renewal, Walter's legacy lived on, a testament to the truth that love, once given, never truly dies, but continues to walk among us, blessing us with its eternal presence.